Is that okay, Zoe?
Yes, we can see that. Yeah, and we'll
Lovely.
auto recording these presentations in the cloud as well.
Oh,
So
fabulous.
that's
Fabulous. Right. I've just started my timer to make sure I don't waffle on too long. So hi everyone. Yeah, I'm Gareth Williams. So I'm one of there are actually 7 heads of design at the BBC who manage a team of about 220 250 UX designers. But within that team, I manage 2 accessibility teams. There's an internally facing one, which deals with all of the needs of our like 18. Well, there's 18,000 members of staff at the BBC, but we have a lot of disabled members of staff. So we look at the assistive technology side, and I also manage the accessibility team, which is the work of which I'm going to talk about this evening. I set that team up 15 years ago at the BBC. It's not the only thing around accessibility I get involved in. I'm also a member of a group that's doing research into accessible fonts. It's called the Readability Group. I also do accessibility guidelines, games accessibility guidelines.com, one of the co-authors of that, and I judge at the Tech for Good Awards. So it's good to hear from someone else doing tech for good on the other side of the world as well. So, which is great. So, a little bit about digital accessibility at the BBC. BBC's got a long history around accessibility. So we did our first InVision signing for broadcast television in 1957. In the early 1970s, we pioneered closed captions for television, which launched in 1979. And the 1990s, we were part of a consortium that pioneered audio description for television as well. So, you know, it was a real natural thing that, I mean, I got involved in a team, which was where I set up the accessibility team in a project, 2005, which launched its product in 2007, which was called the iPlayer. So we built the iPlayer to be completely accessible from day one. We learned everything we could in those 2 years about accessibility and then started applying it out to the other products. As you know, internationally, we have an audience of about 500 million people. It's a huge, yeah, and we're publishing thousands of pages of content in 44 languages a day. It's an enormous, enormous organization. So we have a very small accessibility team. There's only 7 of us. There's myself, top left. There's Becky Nancaro, Charlie Turrell, and Alice Whittle, who are all change managers and project managers. And then Jamie Knight and Lion, who comes with Jamie. Some of you may have heard Jamie before. Emma Pratt-Richards and Michael Matthews, who are all research engineers who work within the team. We don't do auditing. I haven't done any auditing for nearly 8 years now. I don't really believe in it. I think we have a very different approach to accessibility, and I'll go into a little bit about that. But yes, we're part of the UX team. It's quite for me, quite an obvious place for an accessibility team to sit, because UX function is horizontal, accessibility is horizontal function in an organization. And pretty much, and I'll say, inaccessibility starts with design, not accessibility starts with design. Accessibility is often treated as a thing that is designed and built. It's not. It's broken by bad decisions. When something is an abstract concept, it's accessible to everyone because we can all imagine it. As soon as we start making decisions, right, in the early days in the design, we start filtering people out. And that's where we stop that from happening. So everyone is trained, everyone is supported, and GEL, which is our global experience language, which is, you know, our design language for the BBC, has accessibility built into it. We also have our standards and guidelines. Now, standards and guidelines are a funny thing. We have our own. They're a version of WCAG, and they're based largely on WCAG, but then they're contextualized to the way that we do things. And originally, we used to use these as an actual tool. We redesigned our own because WCAG, although it is phenomenally useful, it's totally unusable. It's very, very, very difficult. Until you've memorized the whole of it, every time you start anything, you've got to read it all to try and work out what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And so we realized that this was just a massive time suck for everyone. And people got confused, and which bit should I be considering, and how and where. So we rewrote it in a friendlier way. Made sense. So, you know, you'd have your your rationale, your guideline, reference implementations and tests on every single one. But we don't really use this. This is now really more of a reflection of what we do rather than, you know, a thing that we do. Instead, we're moving towards documentation-driven development. Documentation-driven development is instead of say, if you want to build a promo, we have a promo document, and literally you go and pick up the promo document, and the document teaches you how to build an accessible promo. It's not a code library. I'm not really a great fan of code libraries when it comes down to accessibility and doing stuff. Code libraries should be owned by the products. They should be owned by the engineers. The decision of what their code is should be up to them, but how it behaves should be determined by accessibility. You know, you need to be able to give them reference implementations, which we have. If you go and have a look at this, and Zoe, if you can share the URL, that'd be brilliant. But you can go and have a look at it, and there's reference implementations. You can run your code against the reference code. We're going to put test scripts in here as well. So you can build it how on earth you want. As long as it behaves correctly for the end user, we're happy. So if you want to use React or Angular or anything you want to do, you're going to make it very difficult for yourself, but it's still possible and you can still make it accessible. And so we found that actually this has cut down time to, you know, by down to a third of it was to develop components. And so everyone who builds a library is what our intention is, use these direct. So the slide says we've made 15 years of mistakes, so you don't have to. We also made some discoveries on the way. It's an interesting situation how we've got to kind of moving away from guidelines to documentation, because literally we've tried out so many things that have gone horribly wrong over the years, and the organization has allowed us to do this. It's big on R&D, is the BBC, and obviously it's pioneered access services for television in the past. And so it wanted to pioneer digital. So we tried everything from, you know, building tools into web pages that customized pages, and decided they were a really bad idea because customization should happen at the operating system level. And we support it and build everything to support the operating system level choices. You know, and there are numerous others, but yeah, auditing. I know. I'll come back to auditing on this. I think there's a couple of good examples here. So auditing, we find, I think the philosophy really is don't break it in the first place, and you don't need to audit it. And if you're planning to audit it, then you're planning to break it. You know, audit to learn. You know, audit all of your labeling conventions to find out that you're doing them in consistent ways. You know, that's a useful audit. You know, when we did that across our estate, we found we called the play button 5 different things. So we all sat down in a room and went, let's call it one thing, shall we, and make it a little bit more usable for our audience. We all decided on one label, and bingo, that was a really useful audit. But if you're auditing as part of your development process, it can be very, very, very difficult to do stuff, and it's very, very hard to get it right, because you're loading it on the back, front load accessibility at the beginning. The other one is gaming. We produced loads of children's games on our children's services, and we used to make games, mainstream games, and accessible games. So, you know, that we discovered that was a really bad idea, because then when we spent some time basically listening to children, they talk about the games that they play all the time, and we realized that we were segregating children by doing 2 sets of games. And so we've moved everything to our own gaming guidelines and our own process to make inclusive games, so as many children as possible can play every game that we produce. So therefore, social currency is created, and you're creating a cohesion, and you know, and you're not leaving any children out of the fun and out of the conversation by doing that. So having said that, we do make mistakes, you know, and you know, we, even when we're pioneering stuff and doing stuff really well on our closed captioning here, we've got a little caption underneath our previous Prime Minister saying, "Prime Minister, I'm eating the First Minister of Scotland." You know, things go wrong. And I think in accessibility terms, you know, and particularly this process that we're moving into is documentation driven. It's okay to make mistakes, as long as you learn from them, as long as you observe them, as long as you acknowledge them, as long as you talk to the people who are at the receiving end of them and understand the user experience, and then you sit down and go, right, how do we mitigate against this? And accessibility is an organic thing, and it grows, and the documents that we're building are living documentation, and they will grow. So as I said before, you know, exclusion rather than inclusion comes from poor design or technical decisions. You know, we've tried to take a sort of social model around the way that we're approaching this. It's it's people. I always like the way it's termed, that people are not disabled, but they're disabled by the things around them that have been badly designed. And that's kind of where we're trying to move from, is that we're trying to move from move to a model where we're just saying, look, everyone should be able to access something in its default state as widely as possible, and we're going to make the right decisions to make sure that we don't exclude people. And one of the things that's happening as part of this process, moving into a more documentation driven and behavioral driven development, which is more around the culture that's being developed around accessibility, is asking always two awkward questions at the beginning when starting to build stuff. And who are you willing to exclude? Is it sounds terribly loaded, which it is in a way, but it's actually a really practical question to ask before you build anything. When you're writing your requirements, actually sit down with the whole team and say, who are we willing to exclude? Are you willing, if this is an English language service, you're going to exclude people who can only speak Chinese? It's a practical thing, unless you just turn around and say, well, there's Google Translate and stuff, but we're not going to build to that. We're not going to test to that. What about, Opera browsers with 240 pixel wide screens on feature phones? Are we going to do that? We're going to support Netscape, Mosaic. You are going to have practical questions. They're a bit extreme, those, but it's really good to do that, because if you turn around and say, well, there are groups of people we're not going to exclude, every decision that you make, you look back and go, will I exclude them? and it gives you a good benchmark of maybe we shouldn't make that decision if it's going to have a really negative impact. And then also the one is who gets the full experience. And by that, it's like the full JavaScript experience. Who gets the full back experience? You're always going to have legacy devices, legacy assistive technologies, legacy platforms. You want to fall back to something that they can support. And a good example of that for us is by building using progressive enhancement to be able to build that fallback experience. During the 2012 Olympics, literally on the launch day, we had a huge failure on our results table. And on the day of the opening of the Olympics, and it was this full JavaScript experience. It was completely accessible. We tested it to death. It was fantastic. And the whole thing failed. It fell back to the HTML, which worked perfectly well as a results table. Again, really good on accessibility. But it meant that no one lost anything. And actually, we decided not to fix it and left the HTML one up for the entirety of the rest of the Olympics. And nobody noticed because you've always got this fallback to the HTML experience. Multimodality, I'm just going to rattle through a few things. I think these are things that you always need to consider, and what we've built into our document. Oh, suddenly got a noise, but sorry. So multimodality is something that we kind of build into everything that we do. We always try and think of it, and you think multimodality is sort of coming to UX quite recently, but I think if you work in accessibility, you've been talking about this for 20 odd years. If you can't see it, you can feel it through your braille display, or hear it. If you can't hear it, you can read it. Think of everything in a multimodal context. One of the things I always think around that is, that comes from our TV access services background. We have 4 TV access services, though people only ever talk about 3. So subtitles for me is just, that's just like sound and pictures. It's a fundamental that should be on everything. And these days now, it's mainstream. It's not about hearing impairment. It's about situational accessibility. People are now accessing, social media content in loads of different places. And, you just look at Twitter and Facebook's statistics, and like 80% of all videos are watched with the sound switched off. So if you ain't subtitling it, you're cutting out a huge amount of your audience. But the fourth one is a thing we call bimedia production, which we've been doing since the 90s. And so literally is try and script your videos as if they've got no pictures. If you write a radio script and then film it, you then don't need to audio describe it because it completely works without the pictures. It's an incredibly cost-effective way of making things accessible to people who are visually impaired. Great example of that is Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was actually a radio script that they end up filming, and so it was never needed to be audio described. Knowledge is a huge thing that we're doing through this. So the things that we're writing all our documentation as training documents, and they're written in the style of training documents. So you're using the document and learning about accessibility at the same time. And eventually you won't need the document because you'll know how to build accessible promos or everything about accessible forms, etc. The resources themselves as well are so important. So not only do we support accessibility in this way through the resources we're giving us with the documents, that there are other resources that we do. So we spend a lot of time looking at tooling and ways of enabling it. So accessibility, if accessibility is easy, people are going to do it. And if they've got good resources and a limited and focused amount of resources, then they're going to do it well. And they know exactly how to use them. And so we teach everyone how to use screen readers, but screen readers, we teach it as how to use screen readers as a testing tool if you're a tester, how to use it as a design tool if you're a designer, how to use it, as a development tool as if you're a developer, and give them resources and contextualize them to their job. You'll end up finding that accessibility ends up becoming self-sustaining in this way. And there are tons of different ways in which accessibility actually pays for itself. I've talked about the social media subtitles. It's just reach. It actually, by doing it this way, moving to documentation-driven development, we're actually reducing developer time. We're handing resource back to the business, which actually pays for the entire operation. You're improving search engine optimization. You're actually improving UX for everyone. And it actually makes things more robust. And that's where the 2012 Olympics comes in. So if something fails, bingo, you've already got the screen reader UX. There's a chap called Ian Pouncey, who's a brilliant accessibility specialist who I've worked with in the past. And he always says that HTML is screen reader UX. And so, that's, you end up with the UX for everyone. So the screen reader support actually saved our bacon on that time. And the last slide I've got is it's all about culture. So one of the things is the reason why I have 2 change managers and a project manager in the core part of the accessibility team is that, we're now in our 10th year of having an accessibility champions network that it's building the culture and the discussion of accessibility in the organization. I always say, why have a team when you can have an army? And I've got an army of over 200 accessibility champions who just simply, their one role is in every sprint, in every project, they just say, what does this mean for accessibility? How do we make this accessible? And they can be business analysts, developers, designers, testers, product managers, all sorts of people who just want to get involved. They all volunteer, they become part of the network, we train them in their role. They become the go-to person. They have a Slack channel. They all chat amongst each other and have a tendency of fixing each other's problems for us, which makes us fairly redundant at times. But that's great. It's culture that's underneath this. And if it isn't there within the culture, you're always going to have a fight. So thank you very much. I think I might have overrun by a couple of minutes. I apologize for that. But any questions?
We'll just let the attendees know that to ask the questions, there's a Q&A functionality at the bottom of the screen. So please feel free to type in your questions for Gareth there. Otherwise, if our panelists have any questions for Gareth, feel welcome. I know I have a question for you, Gareth. What challenges do you see on the web for, I know that you have dyslexia and ADHD. I just wonder, what challenges do you see on the web for such users? And is there a way that you would recommend that we design to be inclusive of those users?
There's a lot of things. I'll actually kind of reverse that question. I think there's a lot of things that present themselves as fixes around ADHD and dyslexia that you should be more wary of. Accessible fonts. Right. Okay. So this is something I've been doing research, and I've been working design for donkey's years, by the way, before I became an accessibility specialist. My background's sort of art and design. But I also love data. I love looking at data. Anecdote gives you really good questions. And so when people come up with anecdotes and become with insights, then it should lead you to research questions. But data gives you answers. And for all of the accessible fonts out there, I'll call accessible in quote marks, I've never yet to find any data that supports any of their claims. They usually, like my mate Kevin says it's great, and then suddenly it's an accessible font, and I don't care what Kevin says. So we're doing. I mean, we've done our own BBC Wreath, which is we've learnt an enormous amount by building the BBC's own font. We tested it to death with vision impairment, and in loads of different contexts, and we learned so much about accessibility with fonts, and it's incredibly complicated. There's lots of people read in different ways, so that's one of those. It's not a fix-all. And some of them just make your site ugly. I think that's, and I think there's a guy called Bruno Mag who talks about emotional accessibility, and which is quite true. I remember, I hope you don't mind if I swear a bit, but I remember meeting this young chap many years ago when I was on attachment to YouView, which is a TV platform, and which the BBC was part of building, and I was sort of leading accessibility there for 2 years, and I met this young chap, a teenager, and he used a speech synthesizer, and he had lots of stuff attached to his chair. We were having a natter. I asked him about his equipment, and and he said he hated it because it made him look like a wanker. And I looked at it and I thought, yeah, you're a teenage kid, and everything looked like it made by Fisher Price. And and there is an emotional accessibility. He wanted Apple. He wanted cool stuff on his chair. I wanted all of that stuff, because he's a teenage kid. He's self-conscious, and I think there's this whole thing is, people want stuff that they can relate to, that feels good about themselves. And I've kind of drifted off on that, but I think it's also, these whole things about, fixing stuff with color, fixing stuff in different ways. It's I always put myself as a slightly lower concern than other people, because often when you're looking at low contrast versus high contrast, there's a difference between a barrier and a less usable experience. And for me, I'm more interested in barriers. Mostly less usable experiences can be hacked by the user. For instance, I can turn contrast down by literally reducing the brightness of my screen, and I can change style. I can do stuff really, really easily to make things more readable or less, because I have a little bit of Erlins going on and other stuff going on. So that's where that visual, comfort level stuff, I can fix that really simple myself. But you can't turn, it's really, really hard to turn contrast up. So it's more of a barrier for someone with a vision impairment than it was some. So you make decisions based on the level when things can conflict.
Thank you.
So sorry about that. It's kind of gone slightly, but that's the ADHD for you folks.
That's okay. We've had quite a few more questions coming through. So Lauren, are there any questions there?
There's been some great questions coming through. I'll just ask the question from Natalie about how much buy-in did you need from upper leadership to embed accessibility as part of your process?
That's an interesting one. I am at the moment trying to remove share screen. Right, back again. Yes, you really need to go and talk to people about it. And I mean, most people, if they are struggling with supporting it, they're struggling to understand it. And I think if you're dealing with accessibility in an organization, you need to make it understood what it actually is. You need to change the view, because a lot of people think it's a worthy thing, and it's going to be expensive and this, that, and the other. It's not. It's worthwhile. You need to change their view round. And there's lots of good ways of doing that. I think there's that there's always that thing of, isn't it expensive? I think it's one of the big challenges. I mean, the amount of people in the past, someone goes, well, we can't afford to do it. And I've asked to have a look at their balance sheet, because they must have costed it. To understand that it's expensive, they must have some idea, and then say, can I have a look at your costings and let's see what we can do that might be free or good, or let's move it on a little bit. It's funny, no one's ever managed to bring up a balance sheet and showed me that they've done the costings, because they've never done the work. They've always got it in their head. But if you offset stuff against the benefits, so for instance, just look at Twitter and Facebook statistics on caption consumption, and just say our videos are being shared on social media, and if we're not captioning them, 80% of the social media audience is not going to use it, because they view it with the sound switched off. You find those practical things. Color contrast is a really simple one to deal with, because color contrast impacts on everyone. And So color contrast is, for me, it's about using mobile phones in sunshine. So most people, when they want to save battery, they turn the brightness down on their phone, then they go and use it in bright light and ambient spaces. If you're not high contrast, they can't read your content anymore. And so it's a situational and environmental accessibility problem. And so if you pick all of these things and give those kind of really broad benefit things, it's amazing how the conversation switches from why should we do this is why aren't we doing this? Because this just sounds like good design.
Thank you.
And so it's that. Sorry, yeah, rattling on. That's a whole other talk.
Thank you. We've probably got time just for one more question, Lauren.
Sure. So this one is, what is the best way to go about setting up an accessibility army in a business?
I'll tell you the way I did it. I just got permission to email the whole of my division, because we used to basically be all in one part of the UK, and we're now spread all over. But 15 years ago, we were all based in one area, and I just said, look, can I send out an email to the whole division just saying, I'm going to be sat in the boardroom with some free sandwiches and tea this one lunchtime, and if you're interested, just rock up. And that's how we started, and that was 2005. I sent out that email. And there was a queue outside because I couldn't fit everyone in. And literally all these people turned up. Most of them didn't know anything about it, but they were interested in it. And so I found out who everyone was, what they did, and then we started going, right, okay, what decisions do we need to make? What's the plan? And literally we had one plan to start off with, which was actually agree how we were going to do heading structure. And it took us 3 months to describe that there was going to be one heading level 1 on every page and what it did. And literally that army was the first thing. That was our first decision that we made across the organization. And then we found another challenge and another challenge, and we all implemented it. And so we changed the way that we did things slowly, but literally just find all the people that are interested, invite them along. You know, free cake and tea goes a long way.
Thanks very much, Gareth, for that. That was a wonderful